All right, so I've been poring over these articles about this incredible find in Kent. A 6th-century Anglo-Saxon sword, and let me tell you, the craftsmanship is just mind-blowing.
Oh yeah, what have they found?
Well, they found this sword, and it's got silver and gilt on the hilt with all these intricate patterns, even a runic inscription on the blade. I mean, this is not your average run-of-the-mill sword. You know what I mean?
No, definitely sounds like something special.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to deep dive into today.
All right, let's do it.
This sword, it's like a time machine back to the Anglo-Saxon world. And I think what really struck me is how well preserved everything is. It even has remnants of the scabbard.
Wow.
Yeah, and get this, it was lined with beaver fur.
Beaver fur, huh? That's a pretty fancy detail.
Yeah, talk about elite. That's not something you see every day.
Hmm.
And then there's this ring on the pommel, which could point to some kind of oath or allegiance to a powerful figure. You know, when you see stuff like this, it really makes you wonder about the person who owned it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a sword that screams high status. Everything about it, from the materials to the craftsmanship, just points to someone of considerable wealth and power.
And it's interesting because you mentioned that this sword is comparable to finds from Sutton Hoo.
Yeah, exactly. It's got that same level of extravagance and artistry.
And for those of us who aren't archaeologists, what's the big deal about that comparison to Sutton Hoo?
Well, Sutton Hoo is this incredible ship burial discovered in 1939. It basically gave us this unparalleled glimpse into the world of the 7th century Anglo-Saxon elite. I mean, it had everything from weapons and armor to gold jewelry and elaborate feasting equipment. It really revolutionized our understanding of the period.
So finding a sword like this, but centuries earlier in Kent, what does that tell us?
Well, for starters, it suggests that there were powerful figures operating in this region a lot earlier than we thought. You know, it challenges our understanding of how power was distributed and consolidated in early Anglo-Saxon England.
Fascinating. And it's not just the sword. They also found this really intriguing gold pendant in the same grave. It's engraved with what looks like a serpent or a dragon. Were these kinds of symbols common in Anglo-Saxon culture?
Oh, absolutely. Serpents and dragons, they were like these big symbolic powerhouses in Anglo-Saxon art and belief. Often they were associated with strength, protection, maybe even a connection to the supernatural.
I see.
And this pendant, it most likely belonged to a high-status woman, probably a relative of the person buried with the sword.
Oh, wow. So maybe a mother, a sister, a wife?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, we don't know for sure. But this single artifact, it opens up all these questions about their personal connections.
It's like a little puzzle piece, right?
Exactly. And it makes you realize that these weren't just faceless figures from the past. They had relationships, families, stories.
That's what makes archaeology so cool, right? It's like you're connecting with these people across time. And speaking of connections, what's even wilder is that this grave is just one of 12 they found so far in this cemetery near Canterbury. And get this, archaeologists think there could be as many as 200 more graves.
200 more? That's incredible. What a find.
I know, right? So what can we potentially learn from a site of this scale?
Oh, the potential is just enormous. I mean, this is a chance to study not just individuals, but an entire community from the 5th and 6th centuries. And remember, this is right after the Roman withdrawal from Britain, so it's a time of immense change, upheaval, new identities forming. This site could be crucial for understanding how Anglo-Saxon society developed during this pivotal era.
And you mentioned that some graves have weapons in them and others have items like brooches and buckles. What do those sorts of items tell us about the roles that men and women played in this community?
Yeah, so the weapons, things like spears and shields and male burials, well, that suggests a strong warrior culture, which isn't surprising given the time period. It was a pretty volatile time to be alive.
Right.
But the female burials are really interesting. They often contain these beautifully crafted brooches, buckles, and even knives.
Really? Knives?
Yeah, I know, right? It challenges the simplistic notion that Anglo-Saxon women were just passive figures confined to the domestic sphere. These items, they weren't just decorative, they were functional. They suggest that women played these active roles, maybe managing households, engaging in craft production, maybe even participating in some level of defense.
That's really interesting. It's like we're getting a much more complete picture of their lives. And then there's this whole other layer to the story. The article mentioned objects found in the cemetery that have connections beyond Britain, like Scandinavian objects in a 5th century woman's grave, and then later on you see Frankish items popping up in burials. How do those findings fit into the bigger picture of this period?
Those objects, they're like these tangible threads connecting this community to this wider web of cultural exchange and migration happening across post-Roman Britain.
It's like their role was a lot bigger than we might imagine, right?
Exactly. And to be clear, when we say Frankish, we're talking about the Franks, a powerful Germanic group who controlled much of Western Europe at the time. And Scandinavian refers to people from, well, Scandinavia, the region that includes modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
Right, of course.
So seeing their presence in the cemetery, it highlights just how interconnected this period really was. You had people and ideas flowing back and forth across what we now consider these distinct national boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, borders were a lot more fluid back then, weren't they?
Absolutely. And it really aligns with genetic studies that show that something like 75% of the DNA in early Anglo-Saxon remains can be traced back to continental northern Europe.
Wow, 75%. That's a huge chunk.
It is. It really challenges this idea of some kind of pure Anglo-Saxon identity. It was much more mixed and complex than that.
I mean, it just shows you that migration and cultural exchange have always been part of the human story, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's incredible how much we can glean from these discoveries. I can't wait to see what else they uncover as the excavation continues.
Oh, yeah. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Who knows what else is waiting to be found?